There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a ranch when something irreplaceable is gone. Not the silence of an early morning when frost clings to the corn stalks and the world holds its breath before the sun breaks the horizon. Not that silence. This one is different. It has weight. It has memory. It presses against the chest like a hand that won't let go. Thomas Brennan stood at the edge of his equipment yard on a Tuesday morning in September, and he felt that silence for the first time in his 58 years of living on this land. Where the John Deere S790 combine harvester had sat 473 horsepower of gleaming green steel, a machine that cost him $290,000 and 2 years of quiet sacrifice, there was nothing. Just a rectangle of packed gravel, just ghost tire tracks slowly filling with dust, and a note left on the weathered fence post by his wife of 31 years. 3 words, trust me, Thomas. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you what Margaret Brennan did with $290,000 and why it would take Thomas the better part of 6 months to fully understand what she had saved, I need you to understand one thing. This is not a story about a tractor. This is not a story about technology replacing tradition. This is a story about a man who held on so tightly to the way things had always been done that he nearly lost everything he was trying to hold on to. And a woman who loved him enough to make the hardest decision of their marriage in secret because she knew he never would. If you've ever watched something you built with your own hands begin to collapse under the weight of the world, stay with me. Because what Margaret Brennan did in that ranch office on a warm August night and what she placed her signature on in a dealer's office the following morning is one of the most quietly extraordinary acts of love and courage you'll ever know. But first, let me show you how bad things had gotten. To understand Thomas Brennan, you have to understand the land he came from. Brennan Ranch sat on 412 acres of sand hills and creek bottom in north-central Nebraska, Cherry County, about 60 miles south of Valentine. The land had been in the family since 1940, when Thomas's grandfather, William Brennan, bought the first 80 acres for $8 an acre during the tail end of the Great Depression. William was a stubborn man by all accounts, the kind of man who would work a field in the rain because the calendar said it was time to plant regardless of what the weather said. His son, Robert Thomas's father, inherited both the land and the stubbornness, and Thomas in turn had inherited it from Robert in a way that went bone deep, the way only generational things can. 4 generations of Brennan hands turning the same Nebraska earth, each one adding their own layer to the soil, their own story to the land. Thomas had been driving farm equipment since he was 9 years old. His father had set him on the seat of an old John Deere 4020, a 1968 model that smelled of diesel and history, and told him, "You feel the engine through your hands. You listen for when it's happy and when it's working too hard. This machine is your partner. Treat it right and it'll treat you right. Abuse it and it'll break your heart and your wallet in the same afternoon." Those words had never left him. Over the next 4 decades, Thomas had worked his way through 12 different pieces of John Deere equipment, each one a relationship, each one a chapter. A 720 planter that he'd bought used and nursed back to health. An 830 disc that had turned the same fields his grandfather had broken with horses. A 4050 tractor that had pulled him through 3 wet springs when nothing else would start. The green machines were more than tools to Thomas. They were proof. Proof that the Brennan family was still here, still working, still worthy of the land William had bought for $8 an acre when most men were losing everything they had. And the S790, the S790 was the crown jewel. The machine that had taken Thomas 3 years to convince himself to buy 2 more years to save the down payment for, and one sleepless night to finally sign the paperwork on. He had run his hand along its chassis the morning it was delivered, the same way another man might touch the door of a new home, the way a father might touch his newborn child's head for the first time. This he had told Margaret, standing in the driveway with tears he refused to let fall, his voice thick with something he couldn't quite name, is what Dad would have wanted to see. This is proof we made it. Margaret had put her hand on his arm and said nothing. She was already doing math in her head that Thomas couldn't see, math that was beginning to tell her a story that would keep her awake for the next 7 months. But the years had not been kind to Brennan Ranch. Not lately. The drought of 2021 had slashed their corn yield by 38%. Thomas had walked those fields in July of that year, watching the stalks curl and brown under a sun that beat down like a punishment, and he had felt something he'd never felt before: the land refusing to cooperate. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the weather had simply stopped caring about the calendar, about the tradition, about the fact that Brennans had been planting corn in these fields for 80 years, and the rain had always come eventually. It hadn't come. Not in time. A wet spring in 2022 had caused root rot across their east fields, wiping out 60 acres of soybeans entirely. Thomas had stood at the edge of those fields in June looking at plants that had drowned in the same soil that had been too dry the year before, and he'd thought, the land is sick, or I am, or both. Then the input cost, fuel, fertilizer, seed, had risen with a cruelty that felt almost personal. Diesel that had been $2.50 a gallon was suddenly $4.20. Fertilizer that had been affordable was suddenly priced like liquid gold. And the seed corn, the genetically modified miracle seeds that were supposed to drought resistant and pest resistant and everything else resistant, cost more every year while delivering the same yields they'd always delivered, which in bad years meant they delivered nothing at all. By the spring of 2023, Thomas had refinanced the ranch twice. The first time had been almost easy, a straightforward restructuring with the same bank his father had used, First Prairie Bank of Valentine. The second time had been harder. The S790 had been used as collateral, along with a lien on the east fields, and the bank represented in person by a loan officer named Howard Griffith, a man with soft hands and a hard briefcase who had never worked a day of physical labor in his life, had been sending letters. The kind of letters you read standing in the kitchen, then fold very carefully, then place in the drawer under the phone because you cannot bring yourself to look at them again. The kind that start with, "This is a courtesy notice," and end with, "Failure to comply will result in foreclosure proceedings." The letter that arrived in July of that year was not like the others. It was not a reminder. It was not a warning. It was a timeline. Howard Griffith had written in the careful, bloodless language that banks use when they are about to destroy something a family spent 4 generations building, that unless the outstanding balance of $162,000 was paid in full by the 1st of November, foreclosure proceedings would begin. There would be no extensions, no negotiations. The bank had been more than generous with previous accommodations, and now it was time for the Brennans to meet their contractual obligations or face the consequences of default. November 1st. Thomas read the letter 3 times standing at the kitchen counter with the afternoon sun slanting through the window and turning the paper in his hands to gold. Then he folded it, placed it in the drawer under the phone, the drawer that now held 11 other letters, each one a little more urgent than the last, and went out to the barn to work on the S790's header assembly. There was a small problem with the auger drive belt, a slight slippage that didn't need fixing yet but would need attention before harvest. It gave him somewhere to put his hands, somewhere to put his mind that wasn't on the number 162,000 and the date November 1st and the word for closure. He didn't tell Margaret about the letter. He thought he was protecting her. He thought that if he could just figure something out, if the harvest came in strong, if prices rallied, if something somewhere gave him a break, he could handle it himself. He'd been handling things himself for 30 years. This was just another problem. Bigger than most, sure, but still a problem, and problems had solutions if you worked hard enough. He had no idea that Margaret had already opened every other letter in that drawer, had already called Howard Griffith and asked him in her quiet, steady voice exactly what the timeline was and exactly what the consequences would be, had already been doing math, hard, sleepless, desperate math for 7 months. Her name was Margaret Brennan née Morrison. She had grown up on a smaller ranch 20 miles south of Valentine, the daughter of a man named Carl Morrison, who had worked 300 acres of sandy soil and raised Herefords and believed that hard work and faith would see a man through anything. Carl Morrison had been a good father and a good rancher and a man who had trusted the banks when they told him that the loan restructuring in 1984 was just a formality, just a way to help him get through a rough patch in the cattle market. The banks had lied. Margaret had been 13 years old in 1985 when the foreclosure notice came. She had stood on the front porch of that house, a white house with green shutters that her mother had painted herself, and watched the equipment auction, had watched strangers with clipboards and calculating eyes walk around her father's tractors, his cattle trailers, his hay balers, had watched them knock on the tires and peer into the cabs and talk in low voices about condition and market value and whether it was worth the drive out here. She had watched strangers load her father's John Deere onto a flatbed truck, the same tractor her father had taught her to drive when she was 10, sitting on his lap with her hands on the wheel and his hands over hers guiding. The same tractor he'd used to pull her and her sister Rachel on a sled behind it in the winters, driving slow circles in the pasture while they screamed with laughter. She had watched her father stand very still with his arms crossed over his chest, not watching, staring at nothing, his face the color of ash. She had sworn at 13 years old that she would never watch that happen again, not to anyone, and especially not to a man she loved. 54-year-old Margaret Brennan remembered every detail of that afternoon. The smell of diesel and summer dust, the sound of the auctioneer's voice carrying across the yard, the way her mother had gone inside and closed the bedroom door and didn't come out for the rest of the day, the way her father had stood on that porch until the sun went down and the trucks were gone and there was nothing left but empty spaces in the equipment yard and a debt that wouldn't be paid for another decade. It was that memory, that 13-year-old girl on the porch watching her father's face turn to stone, that drove 54-year-old Margaret to open a browser window one February night while Thomas slept and typed 4 words into the search bar that would change everything. Precision agriculture, cost savings, Nebraska. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly. Just something, anything. A way out that Thomas couldn't see because he was too close to it, too deep inside the way things had always been done. She'd been thinking about it for months, since the first letter from the bank, really. Thomas was working harder than she'd ever seen him work, putting in 16-hour days, skipping meals, pushing himself and the equipment and the land as hard as they would go, and they were still sinking. You can't work your way out of structural insolvency. Margaret knew that. She'd watched her father try. She'd watched him work himself into exhaustion, trying to outrun numbers that didn't care how hard you worked. What she found in the next 3 hours, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and the house quiet around her, was something she hadn't expected. Not a miracle, not a shortcut, but a map, a path that led somewhere other than the auction block. She found a webinar, a free 90-minute online seminar hosted by Iowa State University Extension Services titled Precision Agriculture for Small to Mid-Size Farms, a Survival Guide. She almost didn't click on it. It sounded too technical, too much like something meant for corporate operations, not family ranches. But it was free and it was starting in 10 minutes, and she had nothing to lose except sleep. She watched it in the kitchen with the sound turned low, taking notes in a spiral notebook with a green pen, the same kind of pen she'd used for grocery lists and school permission slips in the household budget for 30 years. By the time it ended at 11:47 p.m., she had filled 14 pages. Her hand ached, her coffee was cold, and she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd just learned. The presenter, a lanky, enthusiastic agronomist named Dr. Helen Reeves, had laid out something that Margaret could not get out of her head. She had shown a case study of a 380-acre farm in central Illinois, comparable in scale and crop mix to Brennan Ranch, that had reduced its input costs by 31% and increased its yield efficiency by 22% in a single growing season by switching from conventional large equipment farming to a precision agriculture model. 31% cost reduction, 22% yield increase, one season. The tools at the center of that transformation were things Margaret had heard of vaguely but never really understood: variable rate fertilizer application systems that could adjust the amount of nutrients going into the soil based on what the soil actually needed, not just a blanket application across the whole field. Soil moisture sensors placed throughout the fields, sending real-time data about when and where to water. And most critically, an agricultural drone fleet, autonomous GPS programmed machines that could map soil composition, identify crop stress zones weeks before visible damage appeared, apply targeted crop protection chemicals at a fraction of the conventional volume, and generate yield prediction data so precise that input purchasing decisions became almost scientific rather than the guesswork and gut feeling that had guided farming for generations. Dr. Reeves had shown photographs of the drones. They looked nothing like farm equipment. They looked like something from a science fiction movie, sleek white high tech. Margaret had stared at them and thought, Thomas will hate this. And then she thought, but what if it works? The cost of the complete precision agriculture package for a ranch the size of Brennan's, according to Dr. Reeves, was between $220,000 and $260,000. Margaret had written that number in her notebook and underlined it 4 times. Then she'd sat back and looked at it. It was almost exactly what Thomas had paid for the S790. She closed the laptop, put away the notebook, and gone to bed. She hadn't slept. She'd lain next to Thomas in the dark, listening to him breathe, and she'd thought about numbers, about what they had and what they owed and what it would take to survive. The math, Margaret's math, worked out over the next 6 months across 14 notebooks, 6 months of phone calls and research and calculations checked and rechecked, until she could recite them in her sleep. went like this. The S790 combine represented their most valuable single asset. Its current private market value in good condition with the hours it had on it was approximately $290,000. Thomas had bought it for $310,000, but equipment depreciated and the market for used combines was soft. Still, $290 was real money, more money than anything else they owned. There was $47,000 remaining on the equipment loan they'd taken out to buy it, meaning equity of around $243,000 if they could find a buyer at the right price. The bank debt coming due November 1st, $162,000. That was the number that woke Margaret up at 3 in the morning. That was the cliff they were walking toward. The complete precision agriculture system. Margaret had begun to research 3 agricultural drones with variable rate application systems, a soil sensor network covering all 400 acres, a data analytics subscription through a company called Granular, and a 1-year implementation contract with a precision ag consultant whose name she'd found in the webinar resources, a man named Marcus Webb, who ran a company out of Lincoln, came to $214,000. She'd called Marcus Webb on a Thursday afternoon in March, while Thomas was in town picking up parts. She'd introduced herself, explained the situation in broad strokes, the size of the ranch, the crops, the financial pressure, the timeline. She hadn't mentioned Thomas's name, hadn't mentioned that her husband had no idea she was making this call. Marcus had listened. Then he'd said, "Mrs. Brennan, I'm going to be straight with you. This kind of transition isn't easy. It requires a complete mindset shift, and it requires capital up front that most people in financial distress don't have access to." Margaret had said, "What if I told you we could liquidate a major asset to fund it?" Marcus had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, "What kind of asset?" "A combine, S790, good condition." Another pause. "That's a $300,000 machine, $290 on the secondary market according to my research. You've done your homework." "I've done nothing but homework for 6 weeks, Mr. Webb." He'd laughed, a surprised, genuine sound. "Okay, let's talk numbers." They'd talk for 2 hours. Marcus had walked her through case studies, implementation timelines, cost breakdowns, expected OEA timelines. He'd been honest about the risks, equipment failures, learning curves, the reality that precision ag wasn't a magic bullet, just a smarter way to farm that required commitment and adaptation. He'd also been honest about the rewards. A ranch your size with your crop mix in your region, he'd said, could realistically expect to cut annual input costs by $60,000 to $90,000 a year. Maybe more, and that's conservative. I've seen operations cut costs by 40% and increase yields by 25%. But that's not the norm. You should plan for more modest returns, especially in year 1. Margaret had done the math on the spot. $60,000 a year in savings with modest yield increases would mean they'd recover the implementation cost in roughly 2 years. Maybe 18 months if things went well. After paying the bank in full with the proceeds from selling the combine, they'd have roughly $29,000 left. Not nothing, not much, but a beginning, a buffer, enough to get through the transition period, hire the custom harvest crew they'd need since they wouldn't have a combine anymore, and cover the unexpected expenses that always came up on a ranch. But here was the key, the thing that Margaret had spent the next 4 months verifying from every angle she could find. A ranch running a precision agriculture model at Brennan Ranch scale could cut annual input costs by between $60,000 and $90,000 a year, while potentially increasing effective yield value by 15 to 20% through smarter application, earlier problem detection, and reduced crop loss. She called farmers in Illinois and Kansas and Minnesota who had made the transition. She'd read university studies and agriculture extension reports until the language became familiar, until she understood terms like NDVI mapping and variable rate technology and prescription farming. She'd learned that what sounded like science fiction was actually just science tools that allowed you to see what you couldn't see with your eyes, understand what you couldn't understand with gut feeling, and make decisions based on data instead of hope. She'd called a farmer named Gerald Hofstad in McLean County, Illinois. He'd been farming for 40 years, 3 years longer than Thomas, and he'd made the switch to precision ag 5 years ago. She'd asked him if it was worth it. He'd said, "Ma'am, I know it sounds crazy if you grew up on green iron. I know it sounds like you're giving up everything that makes farming farming, but I haven't bought a combine in 4 years, and I'm farming more profitably than I ever did. The data tells me things I couldn't see. My soil is healthier, my costs are lower, my yields are better, and when I walk my fields now, I'm not guessing, I know." Margaret had underlined that twice in her notebook. I'm not guessing, I know. She found 3 more farmers with similar stories. 2 in Kansas, 1 in Minnesota, all of them middle-aged men who'd been raised the same way Thomas had been raised, who'd learned farming from fathers, who'd learned it from their fathers. All of them had made the leap. All of them had survived it. Most of them were thriving. But it was the last section of the final notebook that Margaret had written in late July, a week before she made the call to Paul Sternberg, the equipment dealer in Cedar Rapids, that told the whole truth of what she was about to do. She'd titled it simply, "Why I Didn't Tell Him." She'd written, "I know what this will cost us. Not the money, the trust, the feeling of partnership. I know how Thomas thinks about control and decision-making and what it means for a man to captain his own land. I know this will feel like a betrayal. It is not. It is the opposite. A betrayal is letting someone you love walk toward a cliff because you couldn't find the courage to step in front of them. The bank's November deadline is real. If I brought this to Thomas as a proposal, he would debate it for weeks, months. We don't have that. He would be unable to see past the combine. The combine is not just a machine to Thomas. It is his father's approval. It is his grandfather's legacy. It is 48 years of believing that a Brennan farms Brennan land with Brennan equipment. I cannot argue against a dead man's dream, but I can save his son's ranch. I have been married to Thomas for 31 years. I have never once acted against his interest. This is not the first time I have done something he didn't ask for that he needed. It is simply the highest stakes. If I am wrong about the numbers, I will have destroyed our marriage and our ranch. If I am right and I have checked these numbers from every angle I can find, I will have given us both the chance to grow old here. Trust me, Thomas. Trust me." The S790 was a magnificent machine. Margaret understood that. She'd watched Thomas maintain it with the kind of care some men reserve for classic cars. She'd seen him walk around it in the evenings, checking fluid levels, looking for wear patterns, making small adjustments that kept it running at peak efficiency. She'd heard him talk about it with other farmers at the co-op, the pride in his voice when someone asked about its performance. But it was also the chain around the ankle of a man she loved who was slowly going under, and the water was rising. Margaret Brennan made a decision. She did not tell Thomas. She wanted to God she wanted to. She had rehearsed the conversation 100 times. In the shower where the water masked the sound of her crying. In the truck on the way to town, talking to herself like a crazy person. In the space between waking and sleeping and at 3 in the morning, when the house was silent and Thomas slept beside her and she lay staring at the ceiling and imagining every possible version of how it would go. She knew exactly how it would go. Thomas would listen for approximately 45 seconds before his jaw would set in that way it set when he'd made up his mind. He would say, "Margaret, that combine is how we harvest. You don't harvest with drones." His voice would be calm, but his hands would do that thing they did when he was trying not to show he was upset, closing into fists and then opening again over and over. And he would be right of a kind. They would need to contract a custom harvester to run the corn and beans, and that was a cost. Probably 8 to 10,000 for a ranch their size. And Thomas would see only the cost, would see only the absence of the machine he'd spent years saving for, because Thomas was a man looking at a field through the same eyes that had looked at that field since he was 9 years old. He could not see it differently. Not yet. Not by himself. And they were out of time. November 1st was coming the way winter comes in Nebraska, inexorably, indifferently, and faster than you ever believe it will. So Margaret made a phone call in July to a private equipment dealer in Cedar Rapids named Paul Sternberg. She'd found his name through a farm equipment broker forum, had read reviews from other sellers, had verified that he was legitimate and paid fair prices. She described the S790 in detail: hours, condition attachments, maintenance records. He asked her to send photos. She did, taking them on a day when Thomas had driven to Norfolk for a parts run. 2 days later, Paul called her back with a number that made her sit down at the kitchen table and close her eyes for a long moment. $287,500. It was more than she'd expected, more than the researched market value. Paul explained that he had a buyer in Iowa already interested in that exact model, that the condition was better than average, that the market for high-hour combines had tightened up, and this one would move fast at the right price. Margaret said, "When can you pick it up?" Paul said, "I can have a truck there next week if you want." She set a date, August 14th, a Thursday. She checked Thomas's calendar. He had a parts order to pick up in Norfolk that day. She called the parts supplier and added an extra component to the order, something they didn't really need, but that would give Thomas a reason to make the trip extended by an hour or two. Time enough. Then she went back to her notebooks, and she kept planning. She told no one except one person, her sister Rachel, who lived in Omaha and who had been 11 years old when their father lost the ranch, and who still remembered it the way Margaret did, as the worst thing that had ever happened to their family. Margaret drove to Omaha on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. She told Thomas she was going shopping, which was true enough. She met Rachel at a coffee shop in the Old Market District. They sat in a corner booth, and Margaret laid it all out. The debt, the deadline, the research, the plan, the sale, the drones, all of it. Rachel listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, Rachel sat quietly for a long moment, stirring her coffee in slow circles. Then she said, "You know he's going to be furious." Margaret said, "Yes." Rachel said, "You know you might be right." Margaret said, "I have to be." Rachel reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "I watched Dad lose everything because He couldn't see a way out that didn't look like farming. You're trying to save Thomas from the same thing. Margaret said, I'm trying. I don't know if it'll work. Rachel said, it'll work. The question is whether your marriage will survive it. Margaret pulled her hand back. If we lose the ranch, the marriage won't survive that either. At least this way we have a chance. The equipment truck came on August 14th, a Thursday, right on schedule. Margaret had been awake since 4 in the morning, had drunk too much coffee, had stood at the kitchen window watching the driveway like she was waiting for an execution. Thomas had left at 7:30, cheerful, kissing her on the cheek and saying he'd be back by early afternoon. The truck arrived at 9. Two men, professional, efficient. A flatbed trailer with heavy-duty tie-downs. They knew what they were doing. One of them asked Margaret if she needed to say goodbye to it. She said, it's not mine to say goodbye to. They had it loaded in under 2 hours. Margaret stood at the edge of the gravel pad and watched the S790 disappear down the county road, heading east towards Cedar Rapids, and then on to Iowa to a farm where someone else would run it through fields that didn't belong to Thomas, solving problems that weren't Thomas's problems. She sat down on the fence post and cried for 20 minutes. Not quiet tears, big shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Then she dried her eyes with the hem of her shirt, walked to the barn, and got back to work. There was still a ranch to run, cattle to check, fences to mend, a husband to face in approximately 4 hours. Thomas came home at 4:17 p.m. She knew because she'd been watching the clock since 4 o'clock, and every minute felt like an hour. He pulled the ranch truck down the driveway at his usual unhurried pace, parked beside the barn, and climbed out with the easy movements of a man who'd just finished a routine errand. She watched him from the kitchen window. He walked toward the equipment shed. Not directly, he had the parts box to unload first, probably wanted to put those away. But then he'd check on the S790. It was what he always did. Check the equipment before he came inside. Make sure everything was where it should be. She saw him round the corner of the shed, saw him stop. For a long time, he didn't move. Just stood there frozen, staring at the empty space where 473 horsepower of green steel should have been. Margaret could see his face from the window, could see the exact moment when his brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. Long enough for a cloud to cross the sun, long enough for a red-tailed hawk to complete a full circle above the east field, long enough for the silence, that specific, terrible silence, to settle in around him. Then he saw the note on the fence post. Margaret had left it there that morning, written on a piece of notebook paper in her careful handwriting. 3 words. She'd thought about writing more, an explanation, a plea, something, but in the end, it was just 3 words. Because what else was there to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? Thomas crossed to the fence post slowly, the way a man crosses toward something he isn't sure he wants to reach. She watched him read it, watched him read it again, watched him look up at the empty space, then back at the note, like maybe he'd misunderstood, like maybe there was some other explanation. Then Thomas Brennan, a man who had not cried in front of another human being since his father's funeral 12 years ago, made a sound that Margaret heard from inside the house through a closed window. A sound that was not quite a cry, and not quite a shout, and not quite anything that had a name. A sound of a man whose understanding of the world had just been damaged in a way he didn't know how to fix. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the truck door slam. Not the usual click slam of a man done with work for the day. This was different. This was the slam of a door that might have been torn off its hinges if the man slamming it had been any angrier. She straightened, set down her coffee cup, which was empty anyway, She'd just been holding it for something to do with her hands and clasped her hands together on the table in front of her. She had been waiting for this moment for 6 weeks, since the day she'd made the call to Paul Sternberg, since the day she'd decided that saving Thomas meant going around him. She had prepared for it, had imagined every version of it, was as ready as a person can be for something that is going to hurt regardless. The back door opened, hard, fast. Thomas stood in the doorway. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was something worse than angry. He was pale, the color of a man who has seen something that has damaged his understanding of the world, something that doesn't make sense and can't make sense, and therefore must be a mistake, must be a dream, must be anything other than what it actually is. He said, "Where is it, Margaret?" His voice was steady. That was the worst part. If he'd been yelling, it would have been easier. But his voice was steady and quiet and absolutely controlled, which meant he was holding on by his fingernails. She said, "Sit down, Thomas." He said, "I don't want to sit down. Where's my combine?" She said, "It's sold, Thomas. It's gone. I need you to sit down and let me explain." "You sold it." "Yes." "You sold my combine." "Yes." "You sold a $290,000 machine without telling me." "Yes." What followed was not the conversation Margaret had rehearsed. It was louder than that and more jagged, and it moved in directions that no rehearsal could have predicted, because rehearsals are scripts, and this was chaos. This was two people who loved each other standing in a kitchen, while one of them tried to explain the unexplainable and the other tried to process the unprocessable. Thomas said things he would later spend months trying to take back. He said that Margaret had no right, that she had betrayed him, that she had taken the one thing that had been his, and made a decision about it without him, like he was a child who couldn't be trusted with his own property. He said words like insane and unforgivable, and at one point, in a voice that cracked like breaking ice, he said, "How could you?" Margaret said things calmly and quietly that in their steadiness were almost harder to hear than the shouts. She said that she'd had no choice, that the bank was going to take the ranch in November, and there was no other way to get $162,000 by November 1st, that she'd done the research, that she'd run the numbers, that this wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Thomas said, "You should have told me." Margaret said, "You would have said no. It's my decision to make. It's our ranch, Thomas, not just yours, our ranch. And I watched my father lose his because he couldn't make the hard choice, and I will not watch you lose ours for the same reason." The argument moved through the kitchen, onto the porch, out into the yard. Thomas paced like a caged animal, his hands opening and closing, his face red, and then pale, and then red again. Margaret stood still, her arms crossed over her chest, her voice never rising above a conversational volume. At one point, Thomas stopped pacing and stood in the failing light with his arms around himself, the way his father used to stand when something had broken that couldn't be fixed. The way Robert Brennan had stood at William's funeral, stiff and formal, and holding himself together through sheer force of will. Thomas said very quietly, "That machine was Dad's dream. That machine was everything we worked for." Margaret said, "That machine was going to be auctioned off by a bank in November, Thomas, on a foreclosure notice like my father's was. And I watched that happen once. I stood on a porch when I was 13 years old, and I watched strangers load my father's equipment onto trucks, and I watched my father's face while it happened. I will not watch it happen again. Not to you, not to us." Silence. The red-tailed hawk was gone. The fields were going gray with evening. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing, calling to each other across the pasture. Thomas said very quietly, "You had no right." Margaret said, "Maybe not, but I had no choice." Thomas slept in the barn that night. Not in the house. He didn't announce it, didn't say he was leaving. Just walked out into the darkness without another word and didn't come back. Margaret knew where he was. She'd known he'd go there. The barn was where Thomas went when things were bad, when he needed to think, when he needed to be around machinery and tools and things that made sense. She left a blanket and a thermos of coffee at the barn door around 10 p.m. after she was sure he wasn't coming back inside. She didn't knock, just set them down and walked back to the house. In the morning when she rose at 5 a.m., the same time she'd been rising for 30 years, the thermos was empty and the blanket was folded neatly on the step. Thomas was already in the east field. She could see him from the kitchen window, a small figure in the distance walking the rows of corn. He did this sometimes when things were very bad, when the weight of the world pressed too heavy on his shoulders. He walked the crops the way his grandfather had taught him, hands brushing the leaves, feeling the texture of the stalks, reading the plants for signs of health or disease or stress. It was prayer of a kind, the only kind Thomas had. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window for a long time. The coffee pot percolated behind her. The sun rose slow and red over the sandhills. She thought, "I might have broken something that cannot be fixed." Then she thought, "I would do it again." 3 days passed. The two of them moved through the house like planets in different orbits, close enough to feel each other's gravity, close enough to know the other was there, but too far for direct contact. Thomas was up before she was out in the fields by the time she came downstairs. He came in for meals, ate in silence, and went back out. Didn't speak unless spoken to. Didn't make eye contact. Meals were eaten in near silence, the only sounds the clink of forks on plates and the tick of the kitchen clock. Margaret tried a few times to start a conversation. "How are the fields looking? Did you get that part ordered? I need to go to town tomorrow if you need anything." Thomas answered in monosyllables. "Fine. Yes. No." On the third evening, Margaret set down her fork and said, "Thomas, we have to talk about this." Thomas said, "I have nothing to say to you." Margaret said, "We're not going to solve this by you pretending I don't exist." Thomas said, "I'm not pretending you don't exist. I'm trying to figure out how to exist with the fact that my wife sold the most valuable thing I own without telling me." Margaret said, "The most valuable thing you own is this ranch, and I saved it." Thomas stood up his chair, scraping harsh against the floor. He said, "You don't know that yet," and he walked out. Margaret worked at the kitchen table during those 3 days. The notebooks had been replaced by a laptop now. Marcus Webb had begun to email regularly equipment delivery schedules, installation timelines, preliminary sensor placement maps. The drone system was being assembled. The soil sensors were being calibrated. The implementation plan was moving forward, whether Thomas was on board or not, because the money had been transferred, the contracts had been signed, and stopping now would mean losing everything. On the fourth day, Thomas found one of Margaret's notebooks on the kitchen table. It was early afternoon. He'd come in for water, hot and dusty from working on the fence line in the south pasture. The notebook was sitting there in a shaft of sunlight, green ink, visible through the open pages. He almost walked past it. His hand was on the refrigerator door. He stopped. He looked at the notebook, looked at Margaret's handwriting, small and precise and covering every line. He opened it. He sat down at the kitchen table, still in his work boots, dust on his jeans, and sweat staining his shirt, and he began to read. This is important. This is where the story changes. Because what Thomas Brennan found inside that notebook and in the 11 that followed it stacked in the kitchen drawer, where he'd been keeping the bank letters for months, the letters he thought Margaret didn't know about, was the kind of thing that reframes a story entirely. It is the kind of thing that once you understand it changes not just what you see ahead, but what you see looking back. Margaret had not just researched a precision agriculture system, she had built a complete multi-year business plan for Brennan Ranch. The first notebook was dated February of that year. It began with a single line written at the top of the first page in green pen, underlined twice, "How do we still exist in 10 years?" What followed was remarkable. She had cataloged year by year the ranch's input costs going back 5 years. Not just the totals Thomas knew. The totals had filed, the receipts had looked at the end-of-year statements with a kind of numb horror, but a breakdown so precise, so detailed that reading it gave Thomas a chill. Fuel for the S790 over a season averaged $17,400 across the last 3 years. The combine's annual maintenance has averaged $9,200. Custom application costs for pesticides and fungicides, $42 an acre for blanket spray, which came to $16,800 for 400 acres. Fertilizer costs nitrogen at 0.58 per pound of actual N phosphorus, at 0.41 potassium, at 0.39, with application rates based on soil test averages from 3 years ago that probably weren't accurate anymore, but were the best data they had, totaling $31,000 in a good year, $38,000 in a year like this one where prices had spiked. She had broken down where the money went, traced every dollar from the bank account to the ground, mapped the financial architecture of their operation with a precision that Thomas, reading it, now realized he'd never really achieved himself. He'd known they were spending too much. He hadn't known exactly where or exactly how much or exactly what could be cut without destroying yields. Margaret had. She had found a study from Purdue University printed out and stapled into Notebook 3, showing that precision variable rate fertilizer application, applying exactly the right amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium based on real soil data rather than uniform field assumptions, reduce fertilizer costs by 28 to 35% on average across Midwestern operations. She'd highlighted this section in yellow. In the margin in green pen, she'd written 28% of $38,000 equals $10,640 saved per year. Conservative estimate. She had found 3 farms in Illinois, 2 in Kansas, and 1 in southern Minnesota that had made the full transition from large equipment, conventional farming, to precision, drone-assisted agriculture. She had called all 6 of them. Thomas knew this because she'd transcribed the conversations in the notebooks verbatim in her careful handwriting. Real farmers with real names and real phone numbers written in the margins. Real numbers, real results. A farmer named Gerald Hofstede in McLean County, Illinois, 43 years old, 3rd generation, had told her, "I know it sounds crazy if you grew up on green iron. I grew up on it too. My dad would roll over in his grave if he saw me farming without a combine. But I haven't bought one in 4 years, and I'm farming more profitably than I ever did. The data tells me things I couldn't see. I can see stress in my crops 3 weeks before it shows up to the naked eye. I can target my spraying to the exact square meter that needs it. I used to spend $40,000 on chemicals. Now I spend $18,000. The drones cost me money up front, but they're saving me 50, 60,000 a year. You do the math. Margaret had underlined that last sentence twice. You do the math. There were more. A woman named Patricia Chen in Douglas County, Kansas. Thomas stopped, reread the name. Chen, not Anglo. He read on his chest tight and then relaxed when he saw the rest of the conversation was about soil sensors and yield mapping, nothing about heritage or background, just farming. Wait, Patricia Chen, Kansas. Marcus would have told Margaret to avoid names that might raise questions, but maybe Margaret hadn't thought about it, or maybe it didn't matter because it was just research, just a phone call, and Thomas was reading this 4 months later in a kitchen in Nebraska, and the point was the data, not the name. He kept reading. A farmer named Robert Lindstrom in Cottonwood County, Minnesota had said, "The learning curve is steep. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm 62 years old, and I had to learn how to use a computer like I was back in school. But my grandson helped me. And now I can pull up a map of my fields on my phone and see exactly where the nitrogen is low, where the moisture is dropping, where the bugs are starting to cluster. It's like having X-ray vision. You can't go back once you've seen what you've been missing." Thomas read that and felt something shift in his chest. 62 years old, learning computers, X-ray vision. But it was the last section of the final notebook that stopped Thomas entirely. The section Margaret had titled simply, "Why I Didn't Tell Him." He read it standing at the kitchen counter. He'd gotten up to get water at some point, though he didn't remember doing it. The glass sat forgotten on the counter. His coffee had gone cold in his hand. Margaret had written, "I know what this will cost us. Not the money, the trust, the feeling of partnership. I know how Thomas thinks about control and decision-making and what it means for a man to captain his own land. I know this will feel like a betrayal. It is not. It is the opposite. A betrayal is letting someone you love walk toward a cliff because you couldn't find the courage to step in front of them. The bank's November deadline is real. Howard Griffith has made it clear there will be no extensions. I have called him 3 times to ask. The answer is always the same: pay in full or face foreclosure. If I brought this to Thomas as a proposal, he would debate it for weeks, months. We don't have that. He would be unable to see past the combine. The combine is not just a machine to Thomas. It is his father's approval. It is his grandfather's legacy. It is 48 years of believing that a Brennan farms Brennan land with Brennan equipment. I cannot argue against a dead man's dream, but I can save his son's ranch. I have been married to Thomas for 31 years. I have never once acted against his interest. I have made 1,000 small decisions that he didn't ask for, but that needed to be made. What doctor to take him to when he threw his back out in 2004? What school to send Evan to when the district was redistricting? What to plant in the kitchen garden? What color to paint the bedroom? 1,000 things that make up a life together. This is not the first time I have done something he didn't ask for that he needed. It is simply the highest stakes. If I am wrong about the numbers, I will have destroyed our marriage and our ranch. If I am right, and I have checked these numbers from every angle I can find called experts I've never met, read studies until my eyes burned, run the calculations until I could recite them in my sleep, I will have given us both the chance to grow old here, to pass this land to Evan if he wants it, or to someone else if he doesn't, but to pass it on as something living, not as a memory of something we lost. I am terrified. I have been terrified since February, but I am more terrified of standing on a porch watching them auction off Thomas's equipment while he stands there with his arms crossed, not watching the way my father stood. I cannot do that. I will not do that. Trust me, Thomas. Trust me. Thomas sat down. He sat down hard in Margaret's kitchen chair, the one she always sat in, the one with the worn spot on the seat from 30 years of her sitting in exactly that position. He put the notebook down on the table. He pressed both hands flat against the cover like he was trying to hold it in place, like if he let go, it might fly away. Outside, across the county road, a neighbor's tractor moved through the distance, a slow green shape against the sky, getting ready for harvest. Thomas watched it without seeing it. He sat at Margaret's table for a very long time. The sun moved across the floor. The shadows lengthened. The house was utterly silent except for the tick of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Something shifted inside Thomas Brennan. Something slow and tectonic, the way a field shifts after a frost, not visible in the movement, but changed utterly. A crack in the bedrock of his understanding. A fissure that once opened could not be closed. He had been so certain that he was right, that Margaret was wrong, that selling the combine was insanity, and everything she'd done was a betrayal of everything they'd built together. He had been so certain. He wasn't certain anymore. He found Margaret in the garden. She was kneeling at the tomato beds, her back to him, pulling weeds with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been pulling weeds from this garden for 3 decades and could do it in her sleep. Her hands moved steadily, mechanically. She didn't turn around when he approached. She knew he was there, he could tell by the slight stiffening of her shoulders, but she didn't turn around. Thomas stood behind her for a moment, looking down at the back of her head, at the gray that had crept into her hair over the last few years, at the familiar curve of her spine. 31 years. He'd known this woman for 31 years, had thought he knew everything about her. He said, "I read them, all of them." She didn't turn around. She pulled another weed, shook the dirt from its roots, set it aside. She said, "I know." He said, 11 notebooks, Margaret." She said, 12. "You missed the one behind the peach preserves in the pantry." A pause and then barely a sound from Thomas, something that might have been a laugh. In another context, the kind that lives just next to grief, the kind you make when the alternative is screaming or crying, and you've already done both, and you're too tired to do either anymore. He said, "Why didn't you just—" She turned around then. Her face was completely open, completely honest, and very tired, in the way that a person is tired when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time, so long that the weight has become part of them, so long that they've forgotten what it feels like not to carry it. She said, "Because you would have said no, Thomas. And I would have been too afraid of losing you to push hard enough. And we would have lost the ranch. And then I would have lost you anyway, because you would never have forgiven yourself, and you would have looked at me every day knowing I'd let you walk into it without trying to stop you." Thomas looked at his wife, his stubborn, brilliant, terrified, magnificent wife, who had spent 6 months teaching herself a new way to farm so she could save a man too proud to save himself, and he said nothing for a long time. The garden smelled of earth and tomato plants and the green smell of things growing. A bee moved lazily from flower to flower on the zucchini plants. The sun was warm on Thomas's back. He said very quietly, "Tell me about the drones." The drones arrived on September 3rd, exactly on schedule. 3 of them packed in custom foam-padded cases that looked more like something from a tech startup then a farm equipment delivery. Each case was black sleek with silver latches and a small logo for a company called Agri-Air Solutions stamped on the side. They looked nothing like anything that had ever been on Brennan Ranch before. Marcus Webb came with them. He pulled up in a white pickup truck with Webb Precision Agriculture Consulting written on the side in green letters, and he climbed out wearing work boots and jeans and a Purdue University cap. He was 34 years old, lanky and enthusiastic in the way of people who genuinely love their work. And he shook Thomas's hand with both hands, the way a person does when they have heard about someone and are glad to finally meet them. Thomas looked at the cases in the bed of Marcus's truck. He looked at Marcus. He said, "My wife says you're good at what you do." Marcus grinned. He said, "Your wife is the most prepared client I have ever worked with, and I've worked with Fortune 500 agricultural companies. She sent me a 30-page document before our first phone call. I have clients with full-time staff who don't send me 30-page documents." Thomas said nothing. He looked at Margaret. Margaret was standing by the porch, her arms crossed, watching. She didn't smile. She just looked back at him, steady, waiting to see what he would do. The next 2 weeks were a revelation, but not a comfortable one. Thomas was not a man who learned new things easily, or rather, he was not a man who had needed to learn entirely new things for a very long time. He knew farming, he knew equipment, he knew soil and weather and the rhythms of the seasons. He knew how to fix a tractor engine with baling wire and stubbornness. He knew how to read the sky for rain and the leaves for disease and the commodity reports for when to sell. He did not know computers. He did not know software. He did not know anything about GPS waypoints or NDVI mapping or algorithmic variable rate application protocols. And the combination of humility and stubbornness required to become a beginner at 58 years old to admit that you don't know something and need to be taught was its own kind of work. Harder in some ways than physical labor, because physical labor you could do alone in silence with only your own judgment to answer to. Learning required asking questions, admitting ignorance, looking stupid in front of someone 30 years younger. Thomas watched Marcus program the first flight path into the drone software and felt a distinct, unfamiliar sensation. He didn't understand what he was seeing. The laptop screen showed a map of Brennan Ranch satellite view overlaid with a grid of colored lines and waypoints and markers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Marcus was talking, explaining something about flight altitude and sensor overlap and coverage optimization, and Thomas was nodding like he understood, but he didn't understand, not really. And finally, he held up his hand and said, "Stop. Explain it again. Slower." Marcus stopped, looked at Thomas, didn't smile in a condescending way, just nodded and said, "Absolutely, let me start from the beginning." He explained it again. Thomas asked him to explain it a third time. On the fourth explanation, something clicked. Thomas pulled out a notebook, a blue one. He had bought it at the hardware store in Valentine the day before, the same brand Margaret used, but blue instead of green, and he began writing things down. The drones flew. That first flight was something Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Marcus set the drone down in the middle of the east field, connected his laptop, checked the flight path one more time, and then pressed a button. The drone's motors spun up with a high-pitched whine that sounded nothing like any farm equipment Thomas had ever heard. Then it lifted off straight up, smooth and controlled, rising to about 30 feet and then moving forward along the pre-programmed path. Thomas watched it cross the field in perfect geometric lines back and forth, covering every inch of ground at exactly the same altitude, exactly the same speed. It took 18 minutes to map 40 acres. 18 minutes for work that would have taken Thomas half a day to walk, and even then he'd only have seen what was visible to the eye. When the drone landed, Marcus pulled up the data on his laptop. Thomas leaned over his shoulder and looked at the screen. What he saw rewrote his understanding of his own ranch. The screen showed a false color heat map of the East Field, the same field Thomas had walked 3 days ago, the same field he thought he knew as well as he knew his own face in the mirror. But the map showed things he hadn't seen, couldn't have seen. Large sections of the field were colored green and yellow, which Marcus explained it meant healthy, vigorous growth. But there were patches of orange and red scattered throughout, concentrated more heavily in the northeast corner and along the southern fence line. Those patches, Marcus said, indicated crop stress, plants that were struggling, not dying yet, not visibly, but struggling in ways that would affect yield if left untreated. What kind of stress? Thomas asked. Marcus zoomed in on one of the red zones, pulled up additional data. This area here, nitrogen deficiency. The plants are running out of food. This area along the south fence, water stress. The soil moisture is lower than optimal. And this area in the northeast corner, he pulled up another screen. This is interesting. This shows signs of early fungal infection. See these patterns? That's the signature of gray leaf spot starting to develop. You can't see it yet with your eyes, but the drone can see the plant's stress response at the cellular level. Thomas stared at the screen. He said, "I walked that field last week. I didn't see any of this." Marcus looked at him. His face was kind, not condescending. He said, "You can't see it with your eyes. That's not a failure, Mr. Brennan. That's physics. The human eye sees visible light spectrum. The drone uses near-infrared and multispectral imaging. It sees stress before the plant shows it visibly, before the leaves turn brown or the stalks start to wilt. You've been walking fields in the dark, essentially. This is turning the lights on." Thomas sat down on a hay bale. He looked at his hands, his 58-year-old farmer's hands, calloused and scarred, and capable of rebuilding a carburetor, or delivering a calf, or fixing fence in a blizzard. Hands that had worked this land for almost 5 decades. Hands that couldn't see in near infrared. He said, "How much damage am I looking at if I don't treat these zones?" Marcus ran some calculations, cross-referenced the stress levels with historical yield data. He said, in the nitrogen-deficient areas, you're probably looking at a 15 to 20% yield reduction at harvest. The water stress areas may be 10 to 15%. The fungal zones, if they're not treated in the next week or two, could lose you 30% or more in the affected areas. Thomas did the math in his head. 40 acres average yield of 160 bushels per acre in a normal year, stressed zones covering approximately 30% of the field. 15% loss across those zones. He was looking at losing roughly 700 bushels. At current corn prices, that was about $4,000 from one field, from one problem he couldn't see. He said, and the drone caught this 3 weeks before I would have noticed it. Marcus said, probably more like 4 or 5 weeks. By the time you'd notice visible damage, it'd be too late to fully treat it. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, what else can it see? Over the next 10 days, the drone showed Thomas Brennan his ranch in a way he had never seen it before. The soil sensor data collected from 81 sensors that Marcus and his installation crew had placed across the 400 acres over 3 days of careful mapping and trenching revealed that the ranch's east fields, the ones that had suffered root rot and reduced yields for 2 consecutive years running, had soil pH levels that were significantly more acidic than the field average Thomas had been working from. Thomas had been applying lime at a uniform rate across the whole ranch based on soil tests from 3 years ago that had given him a single average pH reading. But the sensors showed that the east fields needed nearly double the lime application to bring the pH up to optimal levels. He'd been undercorrecting the problem for years, wondering why those fields kept underperforming, never realizing that the issue was literally in the ground beneath his feet, and he'd been treating it like it was the same as everywhere else. The drone mapping flights, which took less than 2 hours to cover the entire 400 acres, at resolutions that could identify individual plant stress indicators, showed 8 distinct zones of crop stress across the ranch that were invisible to the eye from the ground, but already affecting yield potential. 6 of them were treatable if caught now: nitrogen deficiencies, water stress, early stage pest pressure. 2 of them in the far southwest corner, where the soil transition from sandy loam to heavier clay would have resulted in significant loss at harvest. No matter what Thomas did, but knowing about them now at least meant he could adjust his harvest expectations, plan his sales accordingly, not count on yields from areas that weren't going to deliver. Marcus showed Thomas all of this on the laptop screen, zooming into the false color heat maps with the casual fluency of a man for whom this language was native. This way of seeing was normal. For Marcus, this wasn't revolutionary. It was just farming. Modern farming. The way farming was done now in the 21st century by people who understood that you couldn't compete with gut feeling and tradition anymore, not when the margins were this tight and the costs were this high and the weather was this unpredictable. Thomas, sitting beside him on a workbench in the barn, staring at the screen, felt something like vertigo, like the ground had shifted beneath him and he was seeing the same world from a completely different angle. He said, "I've been farming blind." Marcus said, "You've been farming the way your father farmed. That's not the same thing. Your father didn't have these tools, you own." The targeted spray application runs where the drone applied fungicide and crop protection chemicals only to the stress zones Marcus had identified, rather than spraying the entire field in a blanket application. The way Thomas had always done used 42% less chemical than the conventional approach. 42%. Thomas did that math himself, standing in the barn with his blue notebook, writing out the numbers in careful columns. The custom applicator he usually hired charged $42 an acre for blanket spraying. 400 acres meant $16,800 for a full application. But with the drones, they were only treating about 160 acres, the areas that actually needed treatment, and the drone application was more precise, used less volume costs, less per acre. Total cost for the targeted application, $6,900. Savings, $9,900 on one application. Thomas sat down on a hay bale and did the calculation again because he didn't trust the first answer. The second answer was the same. He did it a third time. Then he stood up, walked to the house, and found Margaret at the kitchen table. Laptop, notebook, coffee, the same position she'd been in every evening for months. She looked up when he came in. He sat across from her and put his blue notebook on the table. He said, "First application run saved us $9,900 in chemical costs on one application." Margaret said, "I know." He said, "How many applications do we run in a full season?" She said 5-6 depending on conditions and pest pressure. And that's before the fertilizer variable rating savings and before the yield increase from the early stress detection and treatment. Thomas sat back in his chair. He looked at the numbers in his notebook. He looked at Margaret. He said, "We could have been doing this." Margaret said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "Since February. I needed to be completely sure before I—" She stopped, started again. "I needed to be completely sure." Thomas looked at his hands on the table. His 58-year-old farmer's hands that had worked this land since he was a child. Hands that could rebuild an engine, deliver a breech calf, feel the texture of soil, and know if it was ready to plant. Hands that were completely incapable of seeing in near infrared, completely incapable of mapping soil pH variations, completely incapable of detecting fungal infections at the cellular level. He said very quietly, "I'm sorry I slept in the barn." Margaret said, "I left you a good thermos." And for the first time in 6 weeks, they laughed together. Really laughed, not the bitter kind or the angry kind or the kind that's really crying in disguise. The kind that comes from the bottom, from the place where two people who've known each other for 31 years keep the shared memories and the private jokes and the understanding that sometimes the only response to absurdity is laughter. The bank payment went through on October 17th, 2 weeks ahead of Howard Griffith's November 1st deadline. $162,000 transferred from the sale proceeds of the S790, which had been held in a dedicated escrow account Margaret had opened in February for exactly this purpose. She'd kept the money separate, untouched, earning minimal interest but safe waiting for this day. Margaret had called Griffith herself to inform him the payment was coming. She'd wanted to make the call, wanted to hear his voice when she told him they were paying in full and early and wouldn't be needing any more courtesy reminders about their contractual obligations. Griffith had been, she told Thomas afterward, professionally pleasant in the way of a man who has been cheated of an outcome he was expecting. He'd congratulated her on getting current with the account. He'd mentioned that the bank would be happy to discuss future lending opportunities if they ever needed capital for expansion. Margaret had said, "We'll keep that in mind, Mr. Griffith," in a voice that made it clear they absolutely would not be keeping that in mind, and hung up. The foreclosure proceedings were never formally filed. The threatening letter stopped. The ranch was free, not just free of the immediate debt, but free of the weight that had been pressing on Thomas for 2 years. The weight that had made him wake up at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and calculating numbers that never added up. The harvest that year was contracted out to a custom combining crew out of Mason City, Nebraska. A decision that cost Thomas a significant amount of pride to accept. He'd never hired someone else to harvest his fields. Never. That was the one thing you didn't outsource, the one thing you did yourself, because harvest was the culmination of the entire year's work, and you needed to be the one who brought it in. But he accepted it anyway because he was learning a different language about farming, and one of the words in that language was delegation. Another word was efficiency. Another was data-driven decision-making. The custom crew was professional and efficient. They had him out in 10 days working dawn to dusk running his corn and beans through equipment that wasn't his doing work that should have been his. Thomas watched from the cab of his pickup truck, feeling something tight in his chest that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been both. The yield data when it came in was not miraculous. Let me be very clear about that. Farming is not a story where technology waves a magic wand and suddenly everything is perfect. The weather doesn't care about your drones. The market doesn't care about your sensors. The fundamental uncertainties of agriculture don't disappear because you bought better tools. The corn yield was up 6% over the previous year. The soybean yield was up 11%. Given the drought stress they'd experienced earlier in the season, given the fact that conventional wisdom said they should have been down 10 or 15%, Marcus Webb called these numbers exceptional. Thomas called them a beginning. But the input cost reduction, that was something else entirely. Total inputs for that harvest season came in at $61,000 below the 5-year average for Brennan Ranch. $61,000 that had previously been spent on over-applied fertilizers, broad-spectrum chemical applications that treated entire fields when only portions needed treatment fuel for the combine maintenance costs for equipment they no longer owned, and the invisible, unmeasured inefficiency of farming by assumption rather than farming by data. $61,000, more than the custom harvesting crew had cost by a factor of 4. Thomas showed Margaret the final accounting spreadsheet on an evening in late October. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her research, where she'd filled 12 notebooks with green ink, where she'd made the decision that had saved them. He said 61,000. She said, I know. Marcus sent me the numbers this morning. He said, that's real money, Margaret. She said, that's 1 year. Wait until you see year 2 when we've refined the protocols and learned the system better. Thomas set the spreadsheet down. He looked out the kitchen window at the fields going dark under a harvest moon. He said, I was wrong. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand on his. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. By spring of the following year, something unexpected had begun to happen. Word travels on gravel roads in rural Nebraska, travels at the co-op, at the feed store, at church potlucks and county extension meetings, and the diner in Valentine where farmers gathered for coffee at 5:30 in the morning before heading out to their fields. Word traveled that the Brennans had sold their combine and bought drones. Word traveled that they were still farming, still in business, hadn't gone under like everyone expected. Word traveled that their yields were up and their costs were down, and they'd paid off their bank debt in full. Word traveled because Marcus Webb had mentioned the Brennan Ranch results in an Iowa State Extension Services workshop in January, not by name, just as an anonymized case study. A precision agriculture transformation on a 400-acre corn-soybean operation in Nebraska. 1 growing season. Input cost reduction, 61,000. Yield improvement, 8% blended average. Implementation costs recovered in 14 months projected. 3 farmers in the room had asked Marcus for the operation's contact information after the workshop ended. Marcus had called Margaret. Margaret had called Thomas. Thomas was in the barn working on a sensor mount that had come loose during the winter. He listened to Margaret explain that 3 farmers wanted to come see the setup, wanted to learn about the drones, wanted to know if it really worked or if it was just marketing hype. He said they want to come see it. Margaret said they want to learn. A pause. Thomas thought about it, thought about what it would mean to have other farmers walking his ranch, looking at his operation, asking questions. Thought about the fact that 18 months ago he had been convinced this whole thing was insane, and now he was being asked to teach other people how to do it. He said, well, I suppose they can come out. And then because he was 58 years old and 4 generations of Brennan stubbornness is hard to fully override, even when you're trying, he added, but we're not doing tour of the drone system on Sundays. Sunday is still Sunday, Margaret said obviously. By the second growing season, Brennan Ranch had added one additional drone, a spray application specialist model that Margaret had researched through the winter and presented to Thomas in March with a cost-benefit analysis that showed it would pay for itself in 2 seasons, maybe less. Thomas had read the analysis, had asked 2 questions, had said, "Order it." Margaret had looked at him surprised. "You sure?" He'd said, "You were right about the first 3. I'm going to trust you on the 4th. Their neighbor to the south, Frank Delroy, had come over in April to watch the first mapping flight of the season. Frank was 61 years old, had been farming the adjacent property for 37 years, and had made some pointed comments at church back in September about folks selling off their heritage for computer toys. He'd shown up on a Tuesday morning unannounced, pulled his truck into the driveway, and walked over to where Thomas was launching the drone in the east field. Hadn't said hello, hadn't apologized for showing up uninvited, just stood there watching with his arms crossed. The drone completed its flight, came back, landed. Thomas retrieved it, pulled the data card, walked toward the barn to upload the information. Frank followed him. They sat at the workbench while Thomas's laptop processed the flight data. Frank didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the screen, watched the heat map populate, watched the stress zones light up in orange and red against the green baseline. Finally, Frank said, "I never thought I'd see a Brennan sell to John Deere." Thomas said, "Neither did I." Frank said, "You miss it." Thomas thought for a moment, genuinely thought the way a man thinks about something he has made peace with. He said, "I miss what it meant, what it represented. I don't miss what it was costing us to keep." A pause, he said, "Margaret was right." Frank looked at him. "You tell her that," Thomas said, "every day." Frank was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "These drones, they really see all that." Thomas said, "They see more than I can, more than I could in 50 years of walking fields." Frank said, "I might have some questions if you've got time." Thomas said, "I've got time." Frank stayed for 3 hours, asked Thomas questions that Thomas, with his blue notebook and his notes from Marcus Webb's training sessions, could actually answer, asked about costs, implementation timelines, learning curves, what happened when equipment broke, how you found someone to fix a drone in Cherry County, Nebraska, when the nearest certified technician was probably in Omaha. When Frank finally left, he shook Thomas's hand and said, "I appreciate you taking the time." Thomas said, "Any time." Frank paused at his truck door. He said, "I said some things at church last fall." Thomas said, "I remember." Frank said, "I was wrong to say them." Thomas nodded, accepted. By the end of the second full season, Brennan Ranch's net margin had improved from 6.8% to 14.2%, 14.2%. The first time Thomas had seen a double-digit margin in 11 years of farming. He told Margaret over dinner one night in October, reading the numbers from a spreadsheet Marcus had sent, his voice carefully controlled, in the way of a man for whom certain emotions still need a container, still need to be held carefully so they don't spill out. Margaret said, "What does that feel like?" Thomas set the spreadsheet down. He looked out the kitchen window at the fields going dark under a harvest moon. He thought about his grandfather buying this land for $8 an acre in 1940. Thought about his father working it for 43 years, never seeing a margin above 8%, never complaining, just working because that's what you did. Thought about himself, 58 years old, learning to farm a different way because his wife had been brave enough to force him to. He said, It feels like something my grandfather started that we're going to finish. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand on his. Outside in the barn, where the old John Deere smell had finally faded, replaced by the clean chemical smell of electronics and the faint whir of charging stations, the drone fleet sat in their cases, charged and ready, waiting for the next field, the next season, the next data that would tell Thomas Brennan things he could not see with his own eyes but had learned to trust. There's a postscript to this story that I want to tell you. A small thing, or perhaps not small at all. In the spring of Thomas and Margaret's second season with the drone system, their son Evan, 26 years old, who'd been living in Omaha, working in logistics for a supply chain company, who had told them both 3 years earlier that he would not be coming back to farm because there's no future in it. Dad, the margins are too tight and the weather's too unpredictable, and I don't want to spend my life one bad season away from bankruptcy. Drove out to Brennan Ranch on a Saturday in April. He didn't call ahead, just showed up. Thomas and Margaret were having breakfast when they heard the truck pull into the driveway. Evan came into the kitchen, hugged his mother, shook his father's hand, accepted coffee, sat down at the table. He said, "Mom called me last week, said you wanted to show me something." Margaret said I wanted to show you what we've been doing, if you had time. Evan said, "I have time." They walked out to the east field, the three of them, the same field that had suffered root rot for 2 straight years, the field that had broken yields and broken budgets, and contributed to a crisis that had nearly ended 4 generations of Brennan farming. Marcus Webb was there. He had come out for a quarterly consulting check-in. He had the drone set up ready for a demonstration flight. Evan stood with his hands in his pockets, watching as Marcus explained. The system showed him the laptop interface, the flight planning software, the sensor array. Then the drones flew. 3 of them synchronized, covering the field in perfect geometric precision. Evan watched them go, watched them return, watched Marcus pull up the data on the screen, watched the heat map populate with information that would guide every agricultural decision for the next 6 months. He stood there for a long time after the drones had landed. Nobody said anything, just stood there in the field under a spring sky, the smell of earth and growing things all around them. Finally, Evan turned to his parents, his 58-year-old father with the blue notebook in his back pocket, his 54-year-old mother with the green pen handwriting that had mapped the path out of the dark, and he said, "Okay, tell me how this works, all of it." Thomas looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Thomas. Thomas Brennan, 4th generation, raised on Green Iron 12. John Deere relationships spanning 49 years, and a memory of his father's hand on the throttle of a 1968 tractor saying, "This machine is your partner," said the most unexpected sentence of his farming life. He said, "Your mother knows more about this than I do. Ask her." And Margaret began to teach her son the language of the land his great-great-grandfather had bought for $8 an acre in 1940, in a dialect that William Brennan could never have imagined, but would have recognized as the same stubborn refusal to let go of what matters. Spring turned to summer. Evan stayed. At first, it was just weekends. He'd drive out Friday evening, spend Saturday and Sunday learning the system, drive back Sunday night. Then it became long weekends, Thursday through Monday. Then in early July, he gave notice at his logistics job in Omaha. His manager had asked why he was leaving. Evan had said, "I'm going back to the family business." His manager had said, "I thought you said there was no future in farming." Evan had said, "I was wrong." He moved back into the spare bedroom in the ranch house, the same room that had been his as a child, The one with the window that looked out over the east field. The one where he'd done homework at a desk his father had built and slept under blankets. His mother had quilted and dreamed about leaving Nebraska for somewhere bigger, somewhere that felt like it had more possibilities. He'd found possibilities in Omaha, good ones. He'd been good at his job, had been promoted twice in 3 years, had a girlfriend who worked in marketing and an apartment in the old market, and a life that looked nothing like farming. But he'd come home for a weekend and watch drones fly across fields he'd walked, as a boy had watched data populate on a screen that showed him things about the land he'd never known were knowable, and something had shifted. Some equation had rebalanced. Margaret taught him the drone software. Thomas taught him to read the soil sensor data. Marcus Webb, on his quarterly consulting visits, began addressing questions to Evan as much as to Thomas, explaining the more technical aspects of the system in language that assumed a baseline of computer literacy Thomas didn't have, but Evan did. Thomas noticed. Thomas didn't mind. Thomas found himself increasingly asking Evan to explain things, to translate Marcus's more technical explanations into terms he could grasp. One evening in late August, Evan came to Thomas in the barn. The sun was setting light slanting gold through the open door. Evan said, "I've been thinking about the cattle." Brennan Ranch ran 50 head of cattle on the western pasture, a small operation, mostly Angus, mostly for supplemental income and land management. They weren't a cattle ranch, never had been. The cattle were almost an afterthought, something to keep the western grass from going to waste, something to diversify the income stream, slightly. Thomas looked up from the workbench where he was repairing a sensor mount that had cracked in the heat. He said, "What about them?" Evan said, "There's a system health monitoring collars, GPS tracking vital signs, behavior monitoring, early disease detection. Same principle as the crop sensors, but for livestock. Each animal gets a collar that tracks their location, their movement patterns, their body temperature, their eating and rumination patterns. The data goes to a cloud server, gets analyzed by AI, and flags anomalies. You can catch diseases 3-4 days before you'd see symptoms." Thomas set down his tools. He said, "How much?" Evan said, "For a herd our size, about 12,000 for the full setup. Installation included, first year of service included. After that, it's about 2,000 a year for the data subscription." Thomas was quiet for a moment. $12,000. 2 years ago, that number would have felt insurmountable, would have been immediately rejected. Now, after 2 years of watching precision agriculture save them 60, 70,000 a year, after watching their margins improve from 6% to 14%, 12,000 felt different, felt manageable. He said, "What's the payoff?" Evan pulled out his phone, pulled up a document. "I ran some numbers. Our vet costs averaged about 8,000 a year over the last 5 years. Most of that is treating sick cattle that we caught late or losing animals entirely because we didn't catch the illness in time. Early detection could cut those costs by 60, maybe 70%. That's 5,000 saved right there. Then there's the productivity gains, healthier cattle, better weight gain, better breeding success rates. Conservative estimate, we're looking at 7 to 9,000 in annual benefit for a 12,000 upfront cost." Thomas said, "You ran the numbers." Evan said, "Yeah." Thomas said, "Your mother know about this?" Evan said, "I showed her the proposal this morning. She said to talk to you." Thomas smiled, a small, complicated smile that contained pride and amusement and something that might have been wonder. He said, "Of course she did." A pause, he said, "Show me the proposal, the full thing," and Evan looked at him. Thomas said, "Do it right, like she did. Show me why it works, not just that it works. Show me the data, the case studies, the farmers who've done it successfully. Make me understand it the way she made me understand the drones." Evan said, "Yes, sir." He left. Thomas stood in the barn alone for a moment, looking out at the fields going dark at the western pasture, where the cattle were settling for the night, lowing softly to each other in the last light. He thought about Evan at 12 years old, bored and restless, sitting on a tractor, doing circles in a field, while Thomas tried to teach him about clutch control and throttle management and the importance of straight rows. Evan, who'd said at 17 that he didn't want to farm, wanted to study business, wanted to work in a city somewhere with air conditioning and weekends off. Avon, who'd come back. That night, Thomas found Margaret on the porch. She was sitting in her chair, the one she'd sat in for 30 years, the wood worn smooth in the shape of her looking out over the fields. He sat down beside her in his chair, the companion piece equally worn. He said, "He's staying, isn't he?" Margaret said, "Looks that way." Thomas said, "He's got ideas." Margaret said, "Good ideas." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I never thought he'd come back. Not after I spent so many years showing him how hard it was, how tight the margins were, how much work it took just to stay even. I thought I'd scared him off permanently." Margaret turned to look at him. She said, "You didn't make it hard. The circumstances did. You gave him what you could with what you had. That's all any parent can do." Thomas said, "I gave him a sinking ship and a stubborn captain who refused to see the iceberg." Margaret said, "You gave him a father who worked himself to the bone, trying to save something worth saving." That's not nothing, Thomas. And now he gets to see what it looks like when that father finally accepted help, finally learned a new way. You're teaching him something more valuable than how to plant corn. You're teaching him how to change when change is necessary. He reached over and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, listening to the cicadas and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night, and the faint whir of a drone on its charging station in the barn. Finally, Thomas said, "Thank you." Margaret said, "For what?" He said, "For being braver than I was, for doing what I couldn't." She squeezed his hand. She said, "We did it together, just on different timelines." And Thomas Brennan, who had spent 58 years believing that a man farms alone, or not at all, understood finally what his wife had known all along, that the strongest thing a person can do is not to hold on when everyone else tells you to let go. It's to know when holding on is the same thing as going under, and to trust someone else to see the difference when you can't. The third year brought something Thomas had not anticipated. Attention. It started small. Frank Delroy, who had come back 3 more times after that first visit, told another neighbor about the drones. That neighbor, a man named Eugene Vickery, who farmed 2 sections south of Valentine, called Thomas and asked if he could come see the operation. Thomas said yes. Eugene came out on a Thursday in March, brought his son with him, a young man in his early 30s, who worked the farm with Eugene and who was hungry for solutions to the same problems Thomas had been facing 3 years ago. Thomas showed them the setup, explained the system, answered questions for 2 hours. Before Eugene left, he shook Thomas's hand and said, "I heard you were crazy, heard you'd lost your mind and thrown away your heritage for some computer gimmick." Thomas said, "I heard that too." Eugene said, "But you're still here." Thomas said, "Still here." Eugene said, "And you're profitable." Thomas said, "More profitable than I've been in a decade." Eugene was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be back with my banker if you don't mind." Thomas said, "I don't mind." By spring, Thomas was getting calls. Not many, but enough to notice. Farmers asking if they could come see the operation, asking how it worked, asking if it was real or if it was just marketing hype, just another agricultural consultant trying to sell expensive solutions to problems that didn't have solutions. Thomas, who had spent 2 years learning to be a student again, found himself improbably becoming a teacher. In May, he and Margaret hosted their first official tour. 6 farmers, 3 from neighboring counties, all of them with operations between 300 and 600 acres, all of them struggling with the same margin compression, the same rising costs, the same unpredictable weather patterns that had been squeezing family farms into insolvency across the Great Plains. Marcus Webb came out to help field the technical questions. Evan ran the drone demonstration, launching the mapping flight and explaining the data interpretation with the fluency of someone who had spent a year immersed in the system. Margaret handed out photocopies of her cost-benefit analysis from the first year, the one from Notebook 7, the one with the green ink and the careful handwriting, and the numbers that had convinced Thomas finally that selling the combine hadn't been insanity. She'd redacted the personal details, removed their names and specific financial information, but left the structure intact: input costs before and after, yield data before and after, savings realized, payback timeline, ROI projections. Thomas stood in front of these men his age and older men who had spent their lives doing things the way their fathers had done them. Men who looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope, and he told them the truth. He said, "2 years ago, I would have laughed at you out of my barn if you'd suggested I sell my combine and buy drones. I would have told you it was insane, that it was throwing away everything my family had built, that it was a betrayal of my father's legacy and my grandfather's vision. I would have been wrong." He said, "This saved us. And it wasn't my idea. It was my wife's, and I fought her on it. I slept in the barn for 3 nights because I was so angry I couldn't stand to be in the same house with her. I was an idiot for fighting her. And if you have someone in your life, a wife, a son, a daughter, a partner, telling you there's a better way, and you're not listening because it doesn't sound like farming the way you know it, because it doesn't look like what your father did or what you've always done, listen anyway, because they might be right, and you might be too stubborn to see it." One of the farmers, an older man named Eugene Vickery, the same Eugene who'd visited in March, said, "But you gave up your combine." Thomas said, "I gave up a machine I couldn't afford to keep in order to keep the land it was supposed to work." That's not giving up. That's choosing. That's deciding what matters more. Eugene was quiet. Then he said, "Did it hurt?" Thomas looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him steady, the same way she looked at him in the garden 2 years ago when he'd said, "Tell me about the drones." Thomas said, "Every day for 3 months. Felt like I'd cut off my own arm, and then it didn't anymore. And now I can't imagine going back." Eugene nodded slowly. Another farmer, younger, maybe 40, said, "What about harvest? How do you harvest without a combine?" Thomas said, "Custom crew costs me $8,000 a year, saves me $30,000 in fuel, maintenance, insurance, and depreciation. That's a $22,000 gain for work I don't have to do myself." The younger farmer said, "But it's not your equipment. You're dependent on someone else." Thomas said, "I'm dependent on Marcus for drone maintenance. I'm dependent on the sensor company for data service. I'm dependent on the internet for cloud computing. Modern farming is interdependent. It's not about doing everything yourself anymore. It's about knowing what to do yourself and what to delegate to people who do it better than you can. By the end of that year, year three, two of the farmers from that first tour had made the transition. One of them, a man named Robert from Keapaha County, called Thomas in December to tell him his first season results. Input cost down 48,000, yield up 9%. First profitable year in 6 years of farming. His voice on the phone was shaking. He said, "Mr. Brennan, I didn't think it was possible. I thought I was looking at selling out, moving to town, getting a job at the co-op or the feed store. I thought farming was done for people like me." Thomas said, "I thought the same thing. I was wrong. You were wrong. We're both still here." Robert said, "Thank you." Thomas said, "Thank my wife. She's the one who figured it out. I just learned to listen." The summer of year three brought something no one had planned for a drought. Not the slow creeping kind that gives you time to adjust, time to pray for rain, and hope the forecasts are wrong, and maybe plant a cover crop or adjust your irrigation strategy. This one came fast and mean June with almost no rain, temperatures pushing 105 degrees day after day, the kind of heat that turns green fields brown, not in weeks but in days. The drone sensors caught it early. Soil moisture levels dropping across the northeast quadrant of the ranch plant. Stress indicators spiking, the false color maps turning from green to yellow to orange in a progression that Marcus Webb, reviewing the data remotely from his office in Lincoln, flagged as critical. Margaret showed Thomas the data on a Tuesday morning in late June. They were at the kitchen table, coffee and laptop, in the now familiar morning ritual of reviewing the overnight sensor reports. She said, "We need to act now." Thomas looked at the screen, looked at the fields through the kitchen window. They still looked mostly green to his eye, maybe a little pale in places, but nothing catastrophic. He said, "How bad?" Marcus Webb, on a video call that Margaret had already set up, said, "Mr. Brennan, if you don't address this in the next 72 hours, you're looking at a 20 to 30% yield loss in those zones, maybe more if this heat continues. The plants are under severe moisture stress. They're shutting down." Thomas said, "What's the fix?" Marcus said, "Targeted irrigation. You'd need a portable drip system, precision placed to deliver water directly to the root zones in the critical areas. It's not cheap for the setup. You'd need probably $40,000. But it's surgical. You're not flooding entire fields. You're watering exactly where the plants need it, nothing wasted. And once you have the system, you've got it for future seasons." Thomas sat back in his chair. He felt something cold move through his chest, the old familiar feeling of costs spiraling, of problems requiring solutions that required money they didn't have budgeted. He said, "We just got out of debt 2 years ago." Margaret said, "I know." Thomas said, $40,000. Marcus on the screen, his face pixelated slightly from the video. Compression said, "Mr. Brennan, I can't make this decision for you, but I can tell you the numbers. No irrigation, you lose an estimated 70 to 80,000 in yield value from those fields, conservative estimate. With irrigation, you spend 40, you save most of that loss, and you have the system installed and ready for next season and the season after that. It's an investment, not an expense." Thomas looked at Margaret. She was watching him, her face calm, but he knew that look. She'd already done the math. She'd probably been doing it since the first moisture alerts came through yesterday afternoon. She was waiting to see if he'd do it too. waiting to see if he'd learned the lessons she'd been trying to teach him for 3 years. He said, "Where's Evan?" Margaret said, "He's out checking the cattle." Thomas said, "Call him in. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. All three of us." Evan came in 20 minutes later, dusty from the pasture, sweat staining his shirt. Thomas laid out the situation, showed him the drought data, the moisture maps, the stress indicators, told him the cost, told him what was at stake. And Evan studied the screen for a long time, zooming in on different sections, comparing the current data to historical baselines. Then he said, "If we don't do it, we lose more than the yield. We lose the credibility. Every farmer who's watching us to see if this precision ag thing is real, if it actually works when things get hard, they're going to see us fail when the data told us exactly how to succeed. That's worse than the money." Thomas looked at his son, 26 years old, seeing angles Thomas hadn't considered, thinking not just about this year's yield, but about reputation, about proof of concept, about the larger story they were telling. He said, "You think we should do it?" Evan said, "I think Mom's numbers are always right. And I think great-grandpa William didn't keep this land through the Depression by playing it safe when it mattered. He took risks, smart ones." Margaret, quiet until now, said, "It's a risk, Evan. I won't pretend it's not. If the system doesn't work as designed, if the drought is worse than projected, if something goes wrong with the installation, we're 40,000 in and still losing yield." Evan said, "But if it works," Margaret said, "if it works, we prove the model holds under stress. That's worth more than one season's profit." Thomas stood up. He walked to the window, looked out at the fields that 4 generations of Brennans had worked, thought about his grandfather buying land for $8 an acre when nobody else was buying anything, thought about his father telling him, "This machine is your partner." Thought about Margaret sitting in this kitchen 2.5 years ago, making a decision that had terrified her because the alternative was worse. He thought about the fact that $40,000 3 years ago would have felt impossible. Now, with their margins improved, with their debt cleared, with 2 years of $60,000 annual savings in the bank, it felt different. Still substantial, still scary, but possible. He turned around. He said, "Order the system. We'll finance it if we need to, but let's see if we can cash flow it first. Check the accounts." Margaret pulled up their financial software. Checked the operating account, the savings account, the equipment reserve fund they'd started building year 2. She said, "We can cover it. It'll be tight for the rest of the season, but we can do it without borrowing." Thomas said, "Then we do it. No debt." Margaret pulled out her phone, started texting the irrigation supplier whose information Marcus had sent over. Evan said, "I'll start mapping the line routes. We'll need a trench for the main lines, lay drip tape for the secondary distribution." Marcus, still on the video call, said, "I'll coordinate with the installation team. We can have them out there tomorrow morning if you commit now." Thomas said, "We commit." And Thomas Brennan, who had spent 58 years believing that going into debt was failure and spending money you didn't have to spend was recklessness, understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet on what you've built, bet on the system you've learned to trust, bet on the data telling you things you can't see with your eyes. The irrigation system went in over 4 days. The supplier sent a team of 3 installers from North Platte. Evan and Thomas worked alongside them, running the main lines from the well pump to the northeast quadrant, trenching through soil that was already starting to crack from the heat, laying drip tape in careful rows along the corn and soybean plantings. It was hard physical work, the kind Thomas knew, the kind that made sense to him. digging and lifting and connecting and testing. His back ached by the end of each day. His hands were blistered from the shovel handle, but it felt good. Felt like farming the way he understood it, even if the technology at the end of all this digging was something his grandfather never could have imagined. Frank Delroy showed up on day 2 unannounced again and pitched in without asking, brought his own shovel, worked until sunset, said figured you could use an extra pair of hands. 2 other neighbors showed up on day 3. Word had traveled the way word travels, and they'd heard the Brennans were installing irrigation, heard they were fighting the drought with precision. Egg heard it was a big operation and a tight timeline. They didn't ask questions, just grabbed tools and helped dig. On the 5th day, a Thursday, they turned the system on. The water moved through the lines, through the main trunk, through the distribution manifolds, into the drip tape, out through the emitters spaced every 12 inches, along hundreds of yards of tubing. The water moved into the soil, soaking in immediately in the dry ground, reaching the root zones of plants that couldn't tell anyone they were dying, but that the sensors said were crying out for moisture. Thomas stood at the edge of the northeast field and watched. Didn't see anything dramatic. No visible transformation. Just water doing what water does, moving through soil toward roots, toward cells, toward the chemistry of photosynthesis and growth. Evan stood next to him. The sun was setting everything gold and red. Evan said, "You okay, Dad?" Thomas said, "Ask me at harvest." 3 weeks later, it rained. A good rain, a soaking rain that lasted 2 days and refilled the stock ponds and turned the creek from a trickle to a flow and brought the moisture levels across the ranch back up to optimal ranges. The fields greened up. The stress indicators on the drone maps dropped back into normal ranges. The plants that had been shutting down opened back up, resumed growing, resumed the long, slow work of turning sunlight and soil and water into corn and soybeans and the food that fed a nation. But the damage elsewhere was done. Thomas drove past neighboring farms and saw brown patches, stunted corn soybeans, already heading into early senescence because the drought stress had triggered reproductive panic. The plants deciding to make seeds now. Right now, even if the seeds were small and the yields were terrible, because that's what plants do when they think they're dying. Frank Delroy stopped by in early August. He looked tired, older than he'd looked in spring. He said, "We're going to be down 30% this year, maybe more." Thomas said, "I'm sorry, Frank. That's brutal." Frank said, Thomas hesitated. Didn't want to rub it in, didn't want to sound like he was bragging. But Frank had asked, and they were neighbors, and honesty mattered. He said, "We'll be down about 8% overall. In the zones we couldn't cover with the irrigation in time, we lost more. But the areas we treated came through." Frank stared at him. 8%. Thomas nodded. Frank said, "The drones told you it was coming." Thomas said, "3 weeks before I could see it, time enough to act." Frank was quiet for a long time. They stood there in the yard between their 2 properties, the gravel road separating Brennan land from Delroy land, the same boundary that had existed for 80 years. Finally, Frank said, "I should have listened last year, when you first showed me." Thomas said, "You're listening now. That counts." Frank said, "Can I come back? See the setup again? Ask more questions?" Thomas said, "Any time." Frank drove away. Thomas watched him go, watched the dust settle on the road, and thought about how pride works, how it keeps you from asking for help until the help might come too late, How learning to set it aside is maybe the hardest thing a man can do. That fall, the harvest numbers came in. Corn yield down 8% overall, but that was almost entirely from the fields that they hadn't been able to irrigate in time the western sections, where the drought had hit before they had identified it, before they had acted. The fields they'd treated with the irrigation system were down less than 2%, basically normal yields in a drought year. Soybeans, which had needed less intervention because they were slightly more drought tolerant, and because the rain had come in time for their critical reproductive stage, were actually up 4% from the previous year. Total input costs, including the $40,000 irrigation system, $73,000 below the previous year's costs. Because the targeted irrigation had been so efficient, because they'd watered only what needed watering, because they'd used the data to make decisions instead of guessing. Net margin for year 3, 16.8%. 16.8% in a drought year that had devastated neighboring farms. Thomas showed Margaret the numbers on an October evening. The kitchen windows were open, cool air coming in the smell of autumn and harvest, and the particular dusty sweetness of corn drying in the fields. She read the spreadsheet twice, set it down, put her head in her hands. Thomas said, "Hey, Margaret, what's wrong?" She looked up. She wasn't crying. She was laughing, that kind of laugh that's so close to crying, it's hard to tell the difference, the kind that comes when relief and disbelief and vindication all hit at the same time. She said, "We did it. We actually did it. 3 years ago, I thought I was going to destroy our marriage and bankrupt us and lose everything. And we did it." Thomas reached across the table and took both her hands in his. He said, "You did it. I just learned to follow." She shook her head. "We did it. All three of us. You trusted me when it was the hardest thing you had ever had to trust." Evan came back and brought fresh eyes. "Marcus gave us the tools, but we did the work together." And she was right. The calls started coming more frequently after that. Farmers from 3 counties over. Farmers who had heard about the Brennan operation, heard about the drought year yields, heard about the margins. A delegation from the County Extension Service came out in November, wanting to document the operation as a case study. A journalist from Nebraska Farmer Magazine showed up in December, notebook and camera, wanting to write a feature. Thomas almost said no to the journalist. Didn't want the attention, didn't want to feel like he was showing off or claiming to have all the answers when he was still learning himself. Margaret convinced him to say yes. She said, "There are 100 farms in this county alone that are in the same place we were 3 years ago. If telling our story helps even one of them, it's worth it." The article ran in February of year 4. It was titled, "The Quiet Revolution at Brennan Ranch, How One Family Saved Their Farm with 12 Notebooks and a Plan." It told the story mostly accurately of a fourth-generation farmer who had nearly lost everything, and the wife who had saved it by selling the most valuable thing they owned and betting everything on a technology the farmer had never heard of. It quoted Thomas saying, "My wife was braver than I was and smarter, and I spent 3 months being angry at her for saving me." It quoted Margaret saying, "I was terrified every day, but I was more terrified of losing something 4 generations of his family had built than I was of him being angry at me." It included photographs, the ranch, the drones, Thomas and Margaret standing in the east field, the field that had almost bankrupted them, that was now their most productive acreage. The week the article came out, Thomas got 17 phone calls. 2 of them were from farmers he'd gone to school with, and men he hadn't talked to in years. Men who'd heard he'd sold his combine and written him off as crazy or desperate or both. Both of them wanted to know if it was true, if it had really worked, if precision agriculture was actually a path forward, or if it was just marketing hype from consultants trying to sell expensive solutions. Thomas told them the truth. He told them it had been the hardest thing he had ever done. He told them Margaret had been braver than he could have imagined. He told them that if they were thinking about it, they should talk to their wives first, their partners, their children, whoever else was invested in the operation. Because chances were good, those people had already been thinking about it longer and harder and were just waiting for permission to say it out loud. One of them laughed, said, "My wife's been showing me articles about drones for 6 months. I kept saying it wouldn't work for us." Thomas said, "I said the same thing. I was wrong." The other one was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Thank you, Thomas, for being honest about how hard it was. Every article I read makes it sound easy, like you just buy the equipment and everything's fine. It's good to hear from someone who actually did it that it was hard." Thomas said, "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and it saved my life. Both can be true." In March of year 4, Howard Griffith came back. He didn't call ahead, just pulled up the driveway one afternoon in his bank-issued sedan, soft hands and hard briefcase, and the same smile he'd had 4 years ago when he'd been sending foreclosure notices. Thomas was in the barn working on one of the drone's landing gear mounts that had developed a stress crack. He heard the car, looked out, felt something tighten in his chest, a reflex, a muscle memory of fear that he thought he'd left behind, but that apparently lived deeper than he'd realized. He walked out to meet Griffith, didn't offer his hand, just stood there waiting. Griffith climbed out of his car. He was wearing a suit, same as always, too formal for a ranch visit. He looked around at the barn, at the fields, at the small drone hangar Evan had built next to the equipment shed, at the solar panel array they'd installed last fall to offset electricity costs. He said, "Hello, Thomas." Thomas said, "Howard." Griffith said, "Place looks good. I heard about what you've been doing here. Very impressive. Innovation. That's what agriculture needs more of." Thomas said nothing. Griffith said, "I wanted to stop by and see if you'd be interested in discussing expansion financing. With your current margins, you could easily leverage your improved cash flow to acquire additional acreage. The Hendrickson place to your north is going on the market next month, 320 acres. You could nearly double your operation. We could structure a very competitive loan package." Thomas said no. Griffith stopped. "No." Thomas said, "We're done borrowing from you, Howard. We're done borrowing from anyone unless we decide we need to and we decide on our terms." Griffith's smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. He said, "Thomas, I understand there may have been some hard feelings about the situation a few years back, but that's just business. You have to understand the bank has fiduciary responsibilities. We can't just—" Margaret's voice came from behind Thomas, sharp and clear. "We understand perfectly." Griffith turned. Margaret was standing on the porch and arms crossed. She'd come out the back door, must have heard the car. She said, "You were ready to take this ranch from a family that had held it for 4 generations because we missed one payment deadline during the worst agricultural economy in a decade. You sent letters that threatened foreclosure while Thomas was working 18-hour days trying to save what his grandfather built. That's not business, Howard. That's cruelty with a briefcase." Griffith's face went red. He said, "Mrs. Brennan, I was doing my job. The bank has policies." Margaret walked down off the porch, crossed the yard until she was standing next to Thomas. She said, And now you're here trying to profit off the recovery we achieved without your help, trying to put us back in debt so you can collect interest for the next 20 years. We paid you what we owed you. We don't owe you anything else, especially not our future. Griffith looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him, steady, feeling Margaret's presence beside him like a shield, like a wall, like 31 years of partnership crystallized into this single moment. Thomas said, "You heard her. We're done." Griffith stood there for another moment, maybe thinking about arguing, maybe trying to find some angle, some way back into the conversation. Then he got in his car. He sat there with the engine running, looking out the windshield at the ranch, at the drones, at the family that had survived him. Then he drove away. Margaret and Thomas stood in the yard watching the dust settle on the county road. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. He said, "That felt good," Margaret said. "It really did." They stood there for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, the smell of spring planting in the air, the sound of Evan's voice from somewhere near the cattle pasture, talking on the phone, probably to the livestock monitoring company about the collar system they'd installed in January. Thomas said, "We're going to be okay." Margaret said, "We're better than okay," and they were. By late spring of year 4, Evan had officially transitioned from helping out to partner. They made it formal with a lawyer and Valentine, a partnership agreement that gave Evan a 1/3 stake in the ranch operations, with Thomas and Margaret holding the remaining 2/3 jointly. The agreement included a buy-in structure where Evan would increase his share over time, eventually taking majority ownership when Thomas and Margaret were ready to step back. It wasn't charity. Evan was earning it. He was working 60-hour weeks managing the drone operations, overseeing the cattle monitoring system, learning the business side from Margaret, accounting, taxes, commodity futures, crop insurance, all the paperwork that farming required in the 21st century. The night they signed the papers, they had dinner at the kitchen table, the three of them, plus Rachel, Margaret's sister, who had driven out from Omaha to witness the signing. Rachel raised her glass of wine and said, "To the stubbornest family I know, and to Margaret, who saved them from themselves." Margaret said, "I had help." Thomas said, "You had resistance. There's a difference." Evan said, "Can we just agree that everyone here is stubborn and someone had to be smart and it happened to be Mom? And now we're all benefiting from the fact that Dad eventually learned to listen." They drank to that. Later, after Rachel had gone to bed in the guest room and Evan had gone out to check the evening drone flight data and make sure the cattle monitoring system was logging correctly, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch. It was a warm night, late May, the kind of night where the world feels like it's holding its breath before summer, where the air smells of growing things and possibilities. Thomas said, "I never said it right. After everything, after I read the notebooks, after I realized what you'd done, after we started seeing the results. I said thank you, but I don't think I ever said it the way I meant it." Margaret said, "You've said it plenty." He said, "No, I mean," he stopped, started again. "I was so angry for so long, and I was wrong, and you were terrified, and you did it anyway, and you saved me from myself, and I don't know if I ever told you that I understand why you didn't tell me, why you couldn't." Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "I wanted to, every single day." Thomas said, "I know, but you knew I'd say no, and you knew that saying no would kill us, would kill the ranch, would kill our future, would kill everything. So you made the call yourself." She nodded. He said, "I would have lost this place, Margaret. I would have stood here and watched Howard Griffith's bank auction it off, and I would have told myself I'd done everything I could, and I would have been lying. I would have done everything I could think of, but I couldn't think of the thing that mattered. You could dwell. You saved me from that. You saved all of us. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright in the porch light. She said, "You would have figured something out." He shook his head. "No, I wouldn't have. I was drowning, Margaret. I was underwater and I didn't even know it. I thought I was swimming. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just pushed through, if I just held on to what we'd always done, we'd make it. But we wouldn't have. We were 6 months from foreclosure when you sold that combine. 6 months. A long silence. The cicadas singing in the cottonwoods. The distant lowing of cattle. The soft whir of a drone on its charging station in the barn. Margaret said, "Would you do it differently if you could go back?" Thomas thought about it, really thought about it, the way you think about questions that matter. He said, "I'd like to say I'd listened to you from the start, that I'd see what you saw and trust it and make the decision together instead of you having to make it alone. But I don't know if I could have. I don't know if I was capable of it then. I was too close to it, too deep in my own certainty that I knew the only way forward." He looked at her. "I am now capable of it because of you, because you showed me that sometimes the person who loves you can see the cliff you're walking toward when you can't see it yourself." She reached over and took his hand. "We're here, that's what matters." He said, "Yeah, we're here." And they were. The ranch is still there. 412 acres of sand hills in Creek Bottom, north central Nebraska, Cherry County. Same land that's been there since the Pleistocene. William Brennan bought it for $8 an acre in 1940. Robert kept it. Thomas nearly lost it. Margaret saved it. Evan will carry it forward. The drone fleet sits in its hangar, 6 of them now waiting for the next season. The soil sensors send their data every 6 hours, reporting moisture levels and temperature and electrical conductivity and pH, painting a picture of the living earth that updates in real time. The irrigation system stands ready, pipes and drip tape and manifolds engineered to deliver water with surgical precision. The fields, green and growing, hold the same earth that 4 generations of Brennans have worked, but they're seen differently now, understood differently, farmed differently. The land doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care if you farm with horses or diesel tractors or drones. It only cares about what you do with it, whether you're smart enough to understand what it needs, whether you're brave enough to change when change is what survival requires. Thomas Brennan learned that. It took him 58 years and a wife braver than he was, and a decision he couldn't make for himself, and 3 years of learning to see the world through new eyes. But he learned it. And on a spring morning in year 4, standing in the same spot where he'd stood 4 years earlier and seen nothing but an empty rectangle of gravel where his combine used to be, Thomas Brennan watched his son program a drone flight path and his wife check soil moisture data, and he thought about that note. "Trust me, Thomas." He understood it now. Not just what it meant, but what it cost, the weight of it, the courage of it, the terrible gamble of acting alone when acting together wasn't possible. Trust isn't about always agreeing. It's not about letting someone else make your decisions or giving up your agency or surrendering your judgment. It's about knowing when to let go of what you're holding so tightly that you can't see it's pulling you under. It's about believing that the person who loves you might see the cliff you're walking toward when you can't see it yourself. It's about being brave enough to follow when you've spent your whole life leading. Thomas pulled out his phone, opened a text message to Margaret even though she was 30 feet away at the kitchen table, visible through the window. He typed 3 words, "I trust you." She looked at her phone, looked up at him through the window, smiled. And Thomas Brennan, fourth-generation farmer, keeper of traditions, student of new ways, understood that the strongest legacy you can leave isn't the land you hold on to, or the equipment you pass down, or the way things have always been done. It's the wisdom to know when holding on is the same as letting go. It's the courage to change when change is necessary. It's the humility to learn from people who see what you can't see. The field stretched out before him, green and living and full of data he couldn't see with his eyes, but trusted was there. The drones would fly. The sensors would report. The harvest would come. The margins would hold. The ranch would survive. And the Brennans would still be here, together.